Good evening and welcome to our second last live panel event. So tonight we are talking again about restorative justice and whether it has a place after sexual abuse or domestic violence. We have another amazing lineup this evening. So on our panel, we have got Wendy, who's here as our survivor, Dr. Steve Kirkwood from Edinburgh University, and Elaine Wroe from Mind Mosaic Counselling and Therapy. And everyone by now will know Victoria, who is keeping an eye on Facebook and on your comments, and also Jackie Forbes, who is doing an illustrative representation of meetings and panel events throughout Survivors' Voices. So Survivors' Voices is a government-funded consultation and giving survivors of sexual abuse and domestic violence the option to give their opinion and voice their ideas on restorative justice. This is done through a consultation paper, so effectively a questionnaire that any survivor can fill in, and it asks multiple questions for you to give your opinion. For Survivors' Voices, it's about your voice as a survivor. Whether you agree or you disagree, we need to hear, because these papers will be used to help shape the way restorative justice will be written in Scotland. So a little bit about the paper. It is confidential. If you want to put your details on it, that's fine, but it is confidential. You do not have to complete all of it. If you want to miss out some questions, you're struggling with some questions, skip by them. And throughout it, if you need any help or any advice, then Isabel's details are on there and they're plastered all over social media, so you can get in touch with her. Also, before you even get to the questions on the consultation paper, there's a link to a video that goes through what restorative justice is and all the myths and misconceptions as well. So that's a little bit about Survivors' Voices. So we'll go straight into speaking to our panelists tonight. So we're going to start with Wendy. So Wendy, obviously you're here as a survivor. So can you tell us your story and how you came to know about Survivors' Voices and get involved?
Yeah, so hi everyone. As Heather's introduced me, I'm Wendy. A number of years ago, I was the victim of a violent crime, and for a number of years since, I've engaged with several services and organisations. I actually stumbled upon Survivors' Voices only a number of weeks ago, just prior to the consultation going live, by pure chance, pure coincidence. And I noticed that they were looking for survivors' voices to feed into this consultation. And so I seen it as an opportunity to send off an email and get involved. And it's been incredibly rewarding, fast moving, and very full on, but it's been brilliant since. So as I say, pure chance, but it's just been very much right timing. So I've became a part of of the service through I think it was a social media post they put out calling for survivors and victims to get involved, and I took the opportunity and I've not looked back.
That's fantastic. Well, that's what it is all about. It's about getting the voices of survivors. So have you taken part in the panel and the focus sessions outside of the social media stuff? Yeah,
I have. Yeah, they've all been really informative. It's been great. Do you know, it's like a wee community that's been built up through it, and there's people that I think I'll probably stay in touch with for years to come again. So it's been a massive kind of, essentially a life-changing opportunity to get involved and to actually do something that allows me to be my true authentic self. It's incredible because you're engaging with people that are all very like-minded and on the same wavelength, and can hold an open discussion with different views, but it's a safe space where everyone respects one another's views. So it's been good.
That's amazing. That's fantastic, Wendy. Thank you. So Steve, you're here obviously as from university, and you're our restorative justice expert tonight. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do in university and again how you became involved in Survivors' Voices?
Thanks very much, Heather, and thanks so much for the invitation to contribute to the discussion. So I'm Steve Kirkwood. I'm a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Edinburgh. I've conducted research on restorative justice, criminal justice, social work, and a range of other topics, such as the experiences of refugees. And I'm a member of the Restorative Justice Forum for Scotland. I co-chair the Scottish Network for Restorative Justice Researchers. And in 2017, I ran a seminar series that explored international and local evidence regarding restorative justice and the possibilities for further development of restorative justice in Scotland. And I've also been a restorative justice facilitator in the past in a voluntary capacity. So I think it was through my work with the Restorative Justice Forum that I was contacted by Ashley, one of your colleagues, to take part. And so I'm delighted to be part of the conversation.
That's fantastic. That's certainly a lot of experience. So that would be good to come back to later, Steve. Thank you. So Elaine, you are our organisational representative and you are here from Mind Mosaic Counselling and Therapy. So yeah, same question. Tell us about what you do and how it ties into survivors' voices.
Yeah, well, Mind Mosaic Counselling and Therapy is an organisation that's been around about 9 years now. We provide counselling and therapy, group work, training, COSCA course, various things. But a part of our organisation and where I'm the project coordinator of the survivor services, that's where I met Ashley. She's part of the Scottish Government funds our survivor service, and we're part of the survivors portfolio supported by Inspiring Scotland. So as the part of the trauma service, we provide trauma therapy, psychoeducational courses to survivors. We give training out to the community to be trauma informed and provide face-to-face counselling. So really that's what we do. It's directed towards people that have experienced abuse in childhood. So that could be neglect, psychological, physical, or sexual abuse. So that's really, that's my bag. That's where I work in. I'm very passionate about working with survivors. We've developed over the 9 years, as I say, supported by the government to expand and develop our service. So it was lovely when Ashley kind of through Isabel invited me on board, because it was just really interesting to me and caught my attention right away with the people I work with and their needs and choice. So it's been interesting. As I say, I'm a bit like Wendy, so only kind of found out about it about 4 weeks ago, but I've really looked into restorative justice and thinking, how does that sit with the people I've worked with, and asking them as well about their opinions about it. So I'm looking forward to tonight.
Excellent. So yeah, it has been a fast moving process. I think this all kicked off with Ashley just in December, and then yeah, the go ahead was, I want to stay February, just start of February. So it has all pulled together quickly. So it's outstanding what has come from this already. I know that the focus groups started off, there's been 1 or 2 before, and they are continuing to go right the way through, and it's really developed. It's Pandora's box, and I have to say, sitting doing these panel events every single week, something new comes up, new questions and different views. So it's fascinating. It's quite an in-depth subject. So I want to go around the panel now and just ask you what your view is, either yourself or who you're representing, on restorative justice, and if it has a place after sexual abuse or domestic violence. And as well as that, why you have those views, be it personally or through facts and figures. So Wendy, obviously you're a survivor. So from a survivor's point of view, what is your views on restorative justice?
So it's a difficult one. Every week, like you say, there's different themes that emerge, and I can see different points every week. But I think, in terms of restorative justice after sexual violence, the only way it should differ from any other crime type is that the facilitator should have a very specific set of skills and experience in relation to sexual harm to facilitate that. I think, at the forefront, that choice has to be there. you know, it should be up to a victim or a survivor of a crime whether they want to engage in that process. And I think that's why I have found this consultation to be so important, because it gives, you know, just like the name suggests, it gives survivors a voice. Ashley and the team are there to provide a voice to people that have had that voice removed from them already. So I think what we're asking for now is, you know, let this be your choice. If we want to take part, it's there. And I think it shouldn't focus as much on whether a victim or a survivor wants to take part or what the detriments are. I think the importance should be placed upon giving them the choice to do it. And I genuinely believe that, you know, restorative justice is a process, and it's a process that organisations will follow suit on. So I think restorative justice doesn't just end with a victim and an offender sitting down together. I think it should encompass a whole host of services and organisations that have been involved along the way. And I genuinely think that this process in restorative justice will open up the path for other kind of services to come on board with it. So, you know, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think it's being done in the right manner. You know, survivors' voices is using the experts, you know, the experts in the sense that people with lived experience, people know, you know, what it's been like to live through something and what their needs are and how to get their needs met. And, you know, the survivors' voices is taking that on board, taking it to government and saying, well, do you know what, their voice has already been removed once, let them have it and give them the choice, put that there to them. And for me, that's, you know, where the importance lies.
Excellent, Wendy. So obviously you're saying that the choice should be there. So do you think the choice should be there from the start, or do you think it should come at a certain point?
So I think the choice should be there, you know, imminently, but with no time restraints, because it's not a linear process and every single person is going to have different needs and expectations. You know, the crime that I was a victim of happened, I think now 13 years ago. And, you know, 13 years ago I wouldn't have been ready. God, even 8 years ago I wouldn't have been ready, but now I am. So, you know, that's not the same for everyone. There's been other panellists throughout the weeks that have maybe said they're ready after 2 years or after 3 years. So I think it's important for that process to be there, you know, as and when the people taking part are ready and willing to engage in it. And I think it should always be victim-led, and that, you know, when they're ready, when they're in a safe place and feel they want to do it, then it's an opportunity that's there for them. And that's another thing that I find important. It's not about forgiveness, it's about an opportunity. And I think there needs to be more emphasis placed on that, because I respect a lot of opinions that have came out, you know, over the course of the last few weeks, that it could be detrimental, or there's a lot of power imbalance. And I think, you know, that may well be the case, but, you know, you're removing someone's power by not allowing them to take that opportunity in the first place. And while I think people do it with the best will in the world, you know, people say, oh, don't do this, it's going to re-traumatize you, or there's going to be too much of a power imbalance, they are inadvertently, again, removing your choice.
Okay, yeah, it's funny you should mention about the power, and people think it's for forgiveness and there's potential for re-traumatization. We had linked up with Alva Griffith from Ireland, who's actually gone through restorative justice, and she's answered 10 of the most common myths and misconceptions, and it's something that's worth watching on the Survivors Voices YouTube for anyone that's watching. If you've got lots of questions, if you go onto the YouTube, there are 10 videos there that answer these. And it goes into some detail, Wendy, about some of the things you were mentioning about it's not just about forgiveness and about the potential of re-traumatization. So it's definitely, that time factor is definitely a recurring question and a recurring theme that has come up through the weeks. So Steve, over to you. So if you can tell us your opinion and obviously your reasonings behind it as well.
Thanks very much, Heather. And thanks also, Wendy, for sharing your views. Actually, I agree with everything that Wendy just said there. I'll just talk through a bit of my own perspective. For me, I think the starting point in deciding what should be done in response to sexual abuse or violence ought to always be what the survivor wants and needs. These wants and needs are likely to be highly personal and will probably change over time. And they could include things like practical help or emotional support, safety, resources, and aspects of justice. Some survivors of sexual abuse or violence may be looking for things that aspects of restorative justice could help them achieve. So when thinking about restorative justice, I think it's helpful to think of it in terms of principles, processes, and outcomes. So some of the key principles of restorative justice are that it's voluntary for everyone involved, that it must be safe, respectful, confidential, empowering, facilitating, and it looks to the future as well as the past. In terms of processes, there are three kind of broad constituents who might be involved in a restorative process. So these are the person harmed, the person responsible for the harm, and the wider community. And a restorative process might involve, actually it could just be with one of these constituents or two or three. The types of common processes we're talking about could be a face-to-face meeting or sometimes shuttle dialogue. So that's where you have a facilitator taking information back and forth between people, or sometimes letters are shared. However, in some cases of sexual abuse, it might not be appropriate or feasible to facilitate such communication between someone who has been harmed and the person responsible for that. So it could be that perhaps some kind of restorative process takes place just with a restorative justice practitioner and with the individual. Or for some, it could be that it actually occurs between the person who experienced the harm and, for instance, a family member who wasn't actually the person who had committed that harm either, but there might be something that could be addressed in that way. And for some, it might actually be an institution which needs to be involved in the process in some way. And when thinking about the process itself, there tend to be three key parts to it. The facts, looking at what actually happened, the consequences, that was who was harmed and what was the nature of the harm, and the future, what should happen now. And also in thinking about the outcomes, the term restore in restorative justice doesn't necessarily mean putting things back to how they were before the harm occurred. But when I think of what they represent, it might be about for the person harmed, that restorative justice is intended to restore feelings of security, self-respect, dignity, and a sense of control. And for the person responsible for that harm, it's intended to restore some responsibility for harmful behaviour and its consequences, to facilitate opportunities to make amends and assist them to take steps to prevent the recurrence of harm. So some survivors of sexual abuse and violence may feel that they can benefit from aspects of this approach, but it's really important, I think, to emphasize that it should only go ahead if it's safe to do so. And so that means undertaking risk assessments, ensuring that practitioners have an understanding of the nature of sexual abuse and violence. And that was one of the things that Wendy mentioned about practitioners needing specialist training and knowledge in this area, and also ensuring that participation is informed and that there's voluntary consent throughout. So my understanding is that for cases of sexual abuse or harm, one thing that survivors are often looking for is to have some element of control over their lives and the justice process, and to have a voice. And the criminal justice system as it currently operates is not well equipped to do either of these things. So a survivor may not be looking for an apology or any compensation from the process, but rather they might wish to have their say and perhaps have some questions answered. My understanding is that having some control over the process allows them to gain back some of the power that's been taken away by the harm, and control which is often denied them by the criminal justice process itself. So being able to tell the person who did the harm exactly what you wish to say can be experienced as being empowering for people. And they may be able to get some answers to their questions, such as why was I targeted, which could help a person to process and move on from the harm, and the criminal justice process tends not to facilitate this. We know that survivors of sexual abuse and violence can also experience feelings of shame and self-blame. So having the person who did the harm take responsibility which I recognise might not always occur, may help the survivor to shift some of those feelings of shame and blame, putting the responsibility for the harm where it belongs with the person who committed it. Just commenting on some of the research evidence, some of the research evidence shows that restorative justice can and does take place in response to sexual abuse and violence in many parts of the world. One of my colleagues, Dr. Estelle Zinstag, has contributed to these panels, and she's reviewed this international evidence and also the research on processes and outcomes of restorative justice in relation to sexual offences by researchers such as Professor Kathleen Daly, Professor Claire McGlynn, and Professor Mary Koss, shows that it can be safe, effective, and empowering. So the wider research, and I'm coming to the end soon, the wider research on restorative justice generally shows that people who take part are more satisfied with it compared with the standard criminal justice process in itself. It helps people to recover from the harm of an offence, and it can also contribute to a reduction in reoffending. And interestingly, the effectiveness tends to be even greater for more serious offences. So overall, I would say there is a place for restorative justice in response to sexual abuse and violence. However, it must start with the needs of the survivor. It needs to be done in a safe manner. Involves significant preparation for those involved and be undertaken by well-trained and informed practitioners. And ideally would also take place in the context of multi-agency partnerships. I think that's probably enough on my views for now. Thanks.
That's fantastic, Steve. Thank you so much. Wendy, you wanted to come in and ask Steve something on what he'd said, didn't you?
Yeah, so I know that you'd touched on the likes of institutions being brought into the process, Steve, and like a multi-agency approach, and that's something for me that, you know, I would find incredible. You know, I've said it throughout this, that restorative justice doesn't start and end with the victim and the offender sitting down together. I think there is a whole host of organisations that become involved in that process, particularly in the criminal justice process, starting with the police, the procurator fiscal, and other agencies that become involved throughout. So do you think that is within a restorative justice remit, that you could seek a restorative process with these institutions that are involved? Is that something that you think is achievable?
I would hope so. The way that I would think about it is that a restorative process might take place and be part of the kind of service or assistance that an individual is given. So ideally, they would already be receiving some kind of support. That a restorative process ought not to just take place in itself without anything around it, because for me that would be quite worrying and could expose the individual. You know, there needs to be a lot of preparation and support going in beforehand, and there also needs to be support following, if, for example, you know, a face-to-face meeting was to take place. So definitely that would be my ideal scenario, that would take place with all of that multi-agency support around it.
And the specific you know, if you've had a particular instance with a police officer throughout, for example, could you ask them to come into the process? You know, if there's maybe been a detriment to the relationship, do you think it would be possible to bring them into the process for a restorative justice kind of scenario as well?
Can I just check, when you say police officer, sorry, were you saying
so
that?
If you've, you know, like when you've reported your crime, if there's, you know, if you've felt that the service you got, for example, wasn't, you know, you felt more harmed by it, because I think, you know, that is often a thing that I think comes up, is re-victimisation by the criminal justice system. So, you know, if you chose not to sit down with the person that's caused you harm, you know, could you then elect to sit down with the service that's caused you harm, whether that be the police or the Crown Office or a solicitor?
I think, yes, that would be a brilliant idea, and I think it could be incredibly beneficial. I'm not sure just to be perfectly honest, how well the institutions would work at engaging with the process. And that's partly because of how these institutions run. But for instance, if a police officer, was willing to take part in a process like that, it could be incredibly beneficial, because it could try. One of the key things for me about restorative justice is that it aims for mutual understanding. And it tries to address issues around safety and power imbalances and so on, to try and encourage that mutual understanding. So that, for instance, if a police officer has been dealing with someone who's been harmed by crime and actually causes further harm in that process, then if you had a restorative justice process, the intention would be to try and increase their understanding of what happened, so that they can understand it, learn from it, and I guess in this case that the institution could actually learn from it. I'm not going to say that doing something like that would be easy, but if it could be facilitated, I think it would be beneficial.
Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you, Steve and Wendy, for your questions. So Elaine, it's your go now. So I'd love to hear your opinion and obviously your reasonings behind it as well.
Yes, well, I tried to not be too scripted tonight and just go with the heart, actually, in my experience of working with survivors and people that have experienced historical abuse, whether that be a singular sexual assault or violent assault or childhood abuse of any kind, the three I mentioned. So it was important for me to bring that in. And I think survivors do need a choice. So anything that gives somebody another choice to heal has got a yes from my organisation and from myself. But I'll go myself a bit as a trauma therapist in things. There's a lot about preparation, external preparation for restorative justice, as in where it is, who's facilitating, all of that stuff, which is hugely important. And I did think about the facilitators would need to be highly trained and trauma, not just trauma informed, really trauma specialists, really to do that role, and also with supervision. But I think for me, working with clients, it'd be really beneficial that they had an internal preparation, and that means some grounding work, some resources to be able to manage a restorative justice meeting, to be able to remain in the here and now and get their voices heard. Because a lot of the neuroscience is you go offline when you're triggered. So how do you then remain online to get what you want out of that meeting? And I'm speaking like this because a lot of the work we do is survivor-led, and survivors said to us, look, we want to know about the neuroscience about this. We want to know how our bodies work, how our brains work, how trauma affects us. So we devised a wee course. Now, it's not like going to uni for a year. It literally is a 6-week course, a couple hours a week. And there's not one person that's come on that has said, I don't know what you're talking about. Because they're survivors, they know that feeling, so they then recognise the symptoms of trauma. So my only fear would be somebody going into that process not internally prepared for it, to be online enough to have their choice and have their voice with that person. And I do think it would be beneficial if it was done well. It has to be done well, and this is where I love this consultation, because you're getting survivors' voices right in at the start before it's developed into what it'll become. Instead of it being developed and then it's not working, you're getting in there first to get experts, to get voices on what it should be like. Because as Steve said, there's a lot of institutional stuff goes on that doesn't happen, doesn't go to plan. There's individuals that you maybe trigger you. There's all of that process that goes on. So you really have to think, this needs to be different. It needs to be really supportive. It needs to be a safe place. There need to be processes put in place for the person that's been harmed to be safe, and also the people facilitating, so they're not suffering vicarious trauma, that they get supervised properly. All of that stuff to make this okay. And I think it was Wendy said earlier about no time bar as well. So I don't want to sit here and say that survivors have to be in counselling for years before you go to restorative justice. I don't think that's the answer. But I think some education around trauma effect and what can come up for you. I'm thinking out one person in particular, there's that having that power to own it. See, the person I'm talking about had done a lot of work on herself, but then she might see the perpetrator in a supermarket or on holiday or walking down the street. She still wants to have that voice is still there. Okay, she doesn't have the behaviours that used to be attached to it that she couldn't control, and that's your fight or flight, you know, getting into anger or running into the supermarket and leaving the trolley. Do you know, it's not that. She had worked through all that stuff herself, but still I want to have that choice to meet that person and to, not about an apology, just so that I can see you in the town or wherever I am and I can walk past you and you're irrelevant to me. Do you know, instead of I'm still triggered, because that kills people. I've done this work, this work with myself. It's all these years later and I'm still triggered because you never had the voice in the here and now. And that's the internal preparation I'm talking about. And I hope I'm not going to be on one, because maybe I should have scripted it.
Not at all. That's what tonight's all about.
Yeah, to get that across. Yeah. So really that was it. But definitely it has to be done well and safe, and the facilitators need to be really trained in it. And it's not a thing you get to be healed. It's just part of an individual's process if they choose to do that at whatever time in their healing process.
So there's a couple of things that you mentioned that have come up actually week on week, and one is about the, obviously having worked with survivors, you've got the concern that yes, it should be available to them, but at the wrong time potentially could be damaging. So do you feel that there's a risk that if people have got the option from day one and they choose to go, okay, I want to try restorative justice, but then they're told you're not ready, do you feel that that could cause an issue as well?
Yeah, but I think that's being a bit of the trauma informed there, the educational around it. So it's not that you're not ready, it's just, do you want to know about this stuff, and then you make a decision. Let us tell you what we know about trauma, how it affects your nervous system, how you go offline, because there'd be nothing worse than getting into this meeting, it's all arranged, it's all kitted out, and then you're triggered and you're sitting there dissociated and you can't think and you can't speak. That would be the worst for me. But that's the hope, that hopefully that doesn't happen, because they have an eternal preparation for anything. Because even like as a trauma therapist, we do stage 1 therapy, so we don't get right into you don't come into your first therapy session and get right into your trauma. You have to put the foundations there for you to manage it without being re-traumatized. To me, that kind of moves on to this restorative justice, if that could be in place as well. Like, it's just known right away that you wouldn't move, you wouldn't talk about your story or all that and be re-traumatized. You do a building block approach so that then you're safe enough. And that's just the neuroscience of it. It's the way our mind and bodies work. It's not about the individual. It really is about human beings in general. And it's interesting once people know about it.
I think it's interesting actually, because it kind of comes back to something you've all touched on, is about the facilitators and how this is facilitated. Because I think it was last week or the panel before, someone had mentioned that there is a fear that unless it's done properly from day one, unless the right processes and the right timing of when different parts come in and who does them is really important. Because like you say, Elaine, they need to be in the right place. They need to know how it's going to work and why each stage is there. And there is obviously that fear that maybe that bit's missed, or it's not, it needs to be right. That process has to be right. And like you said, Elaine, as well, this is what's quite unique, I think, about Survivors' Voices, is that the actual consultation paper has been put together and tested before it even went live with survivors. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that all comes out. So I've got a couple of questions that we have came in during the week. And then I've had the heads up from Victoria that there's questions from the public as well. So the first question we have is, does restorative justice have a place where there has been no crime reported, but a couple is together in an abusive relationship, but want to see if it can work? So, Elaine, what's your thoughts on this one?
I guess for me, that feels different. I don't know, maybe Steve would be able to answer that better, but I think, again, it'd be working individually. As a trauma therapist, you would work individually with both people to get a point whether they could even be in a room to then discuss being together or not being together, but it's a bit individual work.
Yeah, Steve, what about yours?
I think that's different from just the trauma awareness.
Yep, yep. Steve, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it is a tricky one. If no crime has been reported and the person does not intend to report a crime, then it's possible the restorative process might be beneficial because it has all of the structures and process which focuses on people taking responsibility for their behaviors, and also that it's forward-looking. So it ought to be a kind of process that can actually deal with instances of harm and try and manage, for instance, those power imbalances and see, for instance, in this example that was given, you know, whether there is a way that the person who's responsible for that harm can take responsibility for it and take steps to avoid committing it again. And that if the people want to try and, you know, rebuild that connection or whatever, they have an opportunity to do so. But one thing I will say is that, you know, the use of restorative justice in situations of domestic violence and domestic abuse is very, very complex, and we have to be aware of how, for instance, that apologies can be part of the abuse cycle. So I would say yes, it would be possible, but with a lot of caveats around, you know, how it was used in that particular scenario.
Yep. So the other one that we've got from last week was, should restorative services be implemented into existing support services that are focused on the survivor rather than being provided through social services or justice services? So, Steve, let's start with you in this one.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I guess for me, it's probably most helpful to locate these services in some kind of independent service, which focuses on restorative practices and processes. But as I said earlier, and as is touched on in the discussion, that ideally, actually, this kind of work is done in a multi-agency way, so that someone, you know, might be supported by someone who is, say, a qualified, you know, counsellor and trauma specialist in that regard, and you have restorative justice practitioners who are there to facilitate the restorative justice processes. Also, as we've talked about, have to have that knowledge of sexual offending and trauma. But the other services are there and around to support the individuals going through. And this includes, of course, the person who's committed the harm, if they're going to be involved in that process too. That, for instance, there may be a social worker who's working with that individual, for example.
Elaine, what's your thoughts on this? Because obviously you are currently there as a support service as well.
Yeah, well, I agree with Steve. It would need to be independent, because although we wouldn't support people as a therapist, that's in a room and it's confidential, and that's the work you do. So it would need to be something extra from that to support the person to get to restorative justice. And that's how I think the trauma input has to be at the restorative justice level, or wherever that is. And I don't think linked to criminal justice. I think it needs to be kind of separate, but linked into all the services. I think it was Wendy that said earlier about like a multi-agency, but not as we think about it, just linking in at different points in the process, you know, to all support that one individual to get their needs met and get their healing, whether that be the end of their healing or not, or whether it's the start of it, do you know?
Yeah. So Wendy, you did mention at the start about this multi-agency approach. So what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so, like Steve and Elaine have both said, I think it does need to be an independent service, but one that utilises, a number of different organisations, to facilitate the process. Was there anything else that you?
No, but I think you're all agreeing in this one. It's a very complex process. It will have to be put in place with a lot of agencies and networks working together. So you can see why this part, and also the length of time it's going to take to put this together, is given. It's quite the minefield. So thank you for answering those questions. That's good, because they were from last week, so I definitely wanted to get them in. But Victoria, you've got some from Facebook from tonight's visitors. So do you want to take yourself off mute and start with them?
Yeah, so we have a few questions tonight, but the first one was, typically, what are restorative justice facilitators' qualifications and backgrounds? That's a thing we see come up quite a lot.
Steve, I'll throw this one at you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the challenges, I think, in Scotland is that it's a rather undeveloped field. So there are a few training courses that are offered, but there really needs to be a higher level of oversight, I think, of this and accreditation. So in other places, like in England, they have the Restorative Justice Council and ways of accrediting practitioners so that they can ensure they're operating at certain levels. But to my understanding at the moment, although the training is there and there is practice that's going on in restorative justice in Scotland, although I should say not in relation to sexual offences, sexual abuse, to my knowledge, that kind of level of accreditation and really pinning down the qualifications that are required has not been done yet.
Thank you, Steve. I think this came up a week ago as well, and that there was the fear that, like you say, and it's a good question, that if the right training and the right, there's got to be some sort of, it has to be done right, in that it can't just be put out that anybody can charge for this service. It has to be done properly through the right people. Wendy?
Yeah, so I think it's a tricky one, because, I don't think a qualification is enough to deliver such specialist training. And then I also don't think that it's enough to just say, well, you're a survivor or a victim, so therefore you can facilitate it. But I think it needs to be intertwined in both. So like the consultation has done, take on board the views and the needs and the expectations of the very people that you're rolling this process out to, and deliver a kind of person-centred approach around that. So, while qualifications and accreditation is probably going to be needed, there also needs to be conversations had with, like I say, the people that are going to be engaging in the service to ascertain what actually are their needs and expectations. It might be that they would rather sit down with somebody that has specific training or has worked with victims and survivors before, or have been a victim or a survivor themselves. I think there's a whole host of things that need to be taken into consideration. And just from my own point of view, it could potentially be beneficial to, when an organisation is set up and running, can they list their facilitators? Can you meet with facilitators beforehand and find one that you're most comfortable with? Because I think it needs to take place in an environment where you feel safest, and therefore you should have an element of control over that. You should be able to decide who you take in with you. You're not going to go on with anyone. There might be excellent counsellors or facilitators out there, but that doesn't mean they're going to work for you. So it's about finding the one that works for you and giving you that choice is moving forward.
I think that's a brilliant point of view, actually, Wendy, because you need to be right. It's what Elaine said, you have to be in the right place with the right people, comfortable, before you can then move forward onto the next part. Because if you're not in the right place, then how can you keep going down that path and that process when it's not right from the start? So that was excellent. Thank you. Elaine, if you get anything to add to this?
Yeah, just kind of nodding my head with Wendy about, because when you think of counsellors and therapists and all of that, and people see it as professionals and stuff, but if you don't engage with that person and you don't have any psychological contact coming in the room, nothing matters. Do you know what it is? And that's the body feeling. Do you know, whether it be a counsellor, a restorative justice facilitator, or anybody else, you've got to make that connection, or the person won't feel safe enough and it won't happen. So yeah, it's very important to remember that.
Thank you, Elaine. So Victoria, what question have we got next?
Do any of the panel members have an opinion on how a survivor should be made aware of restorative justice services when they are available?
Wendy, do you want to go with yourself first? When do you think it should become, you know, when should survivors become aware of this process?
I think from the moment the process is initiated, I think unfortunately for a lot of these crime types, it won't even make it to court due to the lack of evidence, or, you know, for a whole host of reasons. So I think, you know, for a lot of crimes, you're linked in with the likes of victim support, you know, straight off the bat, so it could be done at that point, because I think restorative justice should and can take place even where there isn't a conviction. So I think it should be brought to the attention of the victim, you know, immediately, although emphasis placed on they don't have to access it immediately, that it can be accessed at any point and there's no time restraints. But as I say, my concern would be around the number of cases that, you know, that don't end up, don't result in a prosecution. You know, would the victim then be essentially, would there be a net widening you know, issue happening where they get lost in the system? So I think it should be put there to coincide with the likes of victim support or whatever services are offered initially, with a view to maybe accessing it further down the line.
Yep, so just that awareness from the start. Elaine, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, probably similar. You want it to be normalised for the start if it's a good solid service and you can trust it, because it's a bit like counselling's available, as you say, victim support, all of that stuff, and they're just words, I suppose, when you have had an assault or you are a survivor of childhood abuse. They're all words, and so it's really practitioners actually having that awareness, because I'm not going to support anything unless I know it's good, and I'm supporting this because survivors' voices in the inset of any project will make it different, and it will. So that's why I'm supporting this, but would still like to see the finished article before I would suggest to people to do it. But you can say the word, do you know? I would say the word if it was there and I had an understanding that we had a solid professional restorative justice system in Scotland. Yep.
Steve, you can see you sitting nodding away. Do you agree with the ladies, or have you got a different opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Scotland, there's a bit of a dilemma, because the services don't exist for restorative justice in cases of sexual harm. So do you increase people's awareness and share information about these services which don't exist, or do you try and create the services, you know, and then try and encourage people to learn about them and engage? I mean, ideally, if you think far in the future, you get to a scenario where, like Elaine was saying, it's just something that people are aware of that exists, like counselling or other forms of support. But, you know, the fact is we're a long way from that. But I think one of the things, just in terms of, you know, who is to tell people about restorative justice, whoever those people are, it's really important that they understand what restorative justice is, because there is always a risk that they could misinform people. It's probably, as like, for instance, Wendy has said, that the organisations like victim support, you know, would be well placed because they're engaging with people who are harmed by crime anyway, and would be a good, you know, well placed to inform people about what it is. But the other thing is that ideally this process is available at any point. As we've said, it may be years before someone would, you know, after an offence where someone wants to access it, so it needs to be accessible in some way.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Steve. So Victoria, I think we've got time for one more question.
What are the panel's thoughts on the place of delivery? Should this be a support organisation or social work department?
Let's go to Elaine.
Yes, I had a reaction there. No, it definitely has to be a safe place. The whole trauma response, as soon as you say department or organisation, or I just see offices, and yeah, and it just gives me the fear. So I think it needs to be a safe place, like the police are starting to do with the trauma now. Do you know, when somebody's had sexual harm, they've created a place that doesn't look like an office building, that you get in and there's a couch and it looks like kind of living room typey, and it just lets the person just relax and come down a few notches. If you're going into a police station, your nervous systems, you're offline, you're not saying anything really that can make sense at that point until you're online a bit. So anything supportive in this process that can make a person feel safe and supported with you. So definitely independent somewhere.
Thanks, Elaine. Wendy.
Yeah, I think I screeched a bit when you mentioned like, social work offices, and obviously absolutely nothing against social work offices, but it's very almost clinical feeling, and I think it does need to be a space that's very relaxed and calm and away from, you know, the havoc that'll often be in a lot of these organisations. You know, away from an office, feeling more like just somewhere relaxing and calming, and I think that you know, that would be a massive factor in probably designing, you know, the thought that goes into designing the service. You know, I think we'll need to take into consideration how to make people feel safe, how to make people feel comfortable. And I know there's a lot of studies on, you know, the likes of colours and things that can be put in a room, and I do think all these things will be an important part to play when it comes to the designing and delivery of such a place.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation right at the start of this with Alva Griffith, who's been through restorative justice in Ireland, and the level of detail that she told me went into it, to the point where who walks into the room first, where are the chairs, who's got there, is your back to the survivor or the perpetrator, where people sit. And some people prefer to be there sitting first, some people prefer to walk in second, how far away the seats, and at some points, you know, it's like, well, maybe you can see the room in advance and see where you're going to be seated, and there is that level of detail, and potentially years in the process running up to it even happening. So again, it goes back to go and watch the myths and misconceptions videos, because they are fascinating. All the questions that I had, because when I came into this, I didn't know what restorative justice was. So it was really good to learn from somebody who'd been through it, just to go, well, what are the questions? So yeah, definitely this comes up. There's quite a few parts in that covers, is covered in those questions. Steve, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with those comments there. In theory, restorative justice facilitators can be based in just about any kind of institution or organization, but so long as they're actually able to undertake the practice in a meaningful way. And so there's maybe kind of a difference between the kind of institutional arrangements and the way that people understand and perceive that particular service. My own personal preference would be for independent voluntary sector organisation. And in terms of dealing with sexual offences, different countries tend to actually have a specialist service which just deals with restorative justice in those types of cases. And talking about the environment, I mean, as a restorative justice practitioner in the past, one of the common things would be for me to undertake, say, that first visit in the person's home. And then in terms of actually facilitating a meeting, if that was going to happen, then it would be about carefully talking through with the people about where would be suitable for them, usually at some kind of neutral place that the people are comfortable with. And it could be in that person's, community or some space that the people have never been before, or whatever is going to work for them.
And you think it's important to be able to see the space in advance for the survivor, because I appreciate that there may be little things that would trigger you, and it could be something no one else thinks about, like a clock, say, as an example. Do you think it's important potentially for the survivor to see the place that's going to happen in advance? Wendy, what about yourself? What's your thoughts on this one?
Absolutely. I think for me, I would like to go and see somewhere in advance, because I think then you get a kind of more realistic feel about whether you're actually ready for it to take place, and whether that place actually does suit you. So even drawing on experiences from the likes of when I've engaged in counselling services in the past, I had a particular room that I liked because I felt safer. The room was darker, and the chair was placed near the door. So at that time in my life, for me, that is what helped me to feel safe. And I think, when you walk into a room, you do immediately, you do get a feel for it and a feel for what's going to take place. And so, yeah, I think the opportunity to go and kind of suss out the room beforehand is a massive bonus.
Thank you, Wendy. So I know, Victoria, there's a lot of questions still on Facebook. I would ask Wendy, Steve and Elaine, if you could, after this, if you've got time, to go on and answer the questions that are on Facebook. I've run over an hour now, so I have to tie it up, but there's so many questions there, and if you guys could go on and answer them, that'd be absolutely amazing. Victoria, if there is a lot, of what we might do is even copy them and email them to you guys to answer, and we can put it out on social this week. But thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you so much for sharing your experience as a survivor. This is all about the survivors' voices, and you having your say and your opinion, and I don't think this would be as authentic and as real as it is if it was just about the experts. That said, Elaine and Steve, thank you so much for your expertise. And yeah, it's been an absolutely amazing discussion. As usual, I have run well over. To everyone watching, just a few reminders. I've mentioned it a few times, but I can't recommend going to Survivors' Voices on YouTube and watching over those videos. There's 10 of them, only about 2-3 minutes maximum each. We still have our information sessions available, so we have one more this week, tomorrow, and we've got 3 next week, and those information sessions basically run through what restorative justice is, what Survivors' Voices is, what the consultation is, and Rachel's there to answer all your questions. The consultation link is in the comments right now on this post. It also goes out every single day on social media, so you can't miss it. Worst case scenario, go to Thriving Survivors website, and under the Survivors' Voices tab, the consultation link is there. And finally, this consultation finishes really soon. It finishes on the 28th of March. We've got just over a week for survivors to have their say and to fill in the questionnaire. So we are asking everybody at this stage, if you just share one post off social, on your own social, be it LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram or Facebook. You don't know who's going to see it and you don't know who it might help. And finally, if anybody needs any help, if this triggers anything or anyone's upset or you're going through the consultation paper and you're struggling, Isabel is there to phone or email anybody. Her contact details are on the paper, they're on social media, they're on this post. No one's alone, there is support there right the way through this. So again, thank you so much to all our panelists, to everybody, to Jackie, to Victoria, and we'll see you next week for a very special final panel. We have Talk Now, and then we have a panel full of survivors coming to speak to us next week as well. So thank you so much, everybody.